So having looked at the historical and cultural background of the Italian Renaissance, let's take a look at the two major directions that emerged from the Renaissance in terms of theater. And first, we talk about a court or academic theater. And this was really wealthy people, right? Nobles and some academics embracing a neoclassical mentality. That is, if the Greeks and Romans did it, we want to do it. And focusing heavily on some really visually impressive ideas about how you put on theater. And we'll give some examples of that later. And then we also have a totally separate genre of theater called Commedia dell'arte, which I'm sure you've heard of before, but generally speaking, this is more theater for the people in the Renaissance. Traveling troupes, doing improv shows, moving from town to town, passing the hat, and it's heavily performative. That is, it doesn't rely on traditionally scripted shows. The shows have a general outline, but it's very much reliant on in-the-moment improvisation. And the reason that we don't read any of these plays from either of these two genres in Theater 317 is quite simply because the court and academic theater was pretty to look at, but kind of boring. It was a sort of historically overly reverent appreciation and redoing of all the Greek and Roman stories. They just didn't do them quite as well. And then Commedia, we don't really have any scripts to read. So it's tough to actually say, we're going to read this Commedia play because they don't exist as plays. They exist as sort of collections of scenarios. So one of the things we get out of the Italian Renaissance is some visually interesting stuff and some good comedy, but not a lot of script archives that are worth reading. So let's start with that academic theater, the entertainment for the rich and the educated. So this is theater that goes on either at a nobleman's court, most often, or occasionally at a university. And this is a very sort of deeply invested social activity for the wealthy people of Italy. It is a point of pride for you to fund and support a theater company. And it's something you can sort of talk to about your other rich friends in the same way that today very, very wealthy people might talk about the racehorses they own or the different yachts that they own and sort of compare and contrast. So it's almost like a pride thing. Well, my theater company does this and they do this, and come on over to my estate sometime and I'll take you through my private, elaborate indoor theater that's basically a demonstration of two things. One, I as a noble have a lot of money, and two, I as a noble know about Greek and Roman culture because I've reproduced it in these elaborate indoor theaters. And I'll show you some images of what I'm talking about. What we get then is a huge emphasis on visual and academic indulgence. Academic indulgence, by that I just mean almost like a historically obsessive recreation of what the Italians thought Greek and Roman theater would have been like. They were wrong in a lot of ways, but they really got really obsessive about the historical detail, and the plays they put on weren't actually that interesting. Then the visual part of it is they got obviously obsessed with the architecture and art of Greece and Rome and wanted to reproduce that in their theaters as well. Again, I'll show you some images here. So this is all about reproducing what the Greeks and Romans did, to an almost obsessive degree that makes the theater sort of boring. But before we get to this amazing stuff, we've got to consider the way in which visual art needed to change in order for there to be anything visually beautiful. So how did this happen? Well, let's take a look at these two images from medieval or early Renaissance art. The one on the left is called Lamentation, and it's they've just taken Christ down from the cross, and obviously, right, we've got angels overhead, and everyone's around mourning him. On the right is the one I showed you earlier in the slideshow, and from the medieval slideshow about how lousy the plague was. One thing you'll notice about both of these paintings is that they do a really terrible job with perspective. Objects don't exactly get smaller as they get further away from the viewer's eye. The one on the left, Lamentation, kind of does a little bit. That tree is headed in the right direction, but it's still really awkward and the painting feels flat. It doesn't feel realistic. Same with on the right. That one feels really flat and the angles are odd. And this is pretty common for everything in terms of visual art that you see all through the Dark Ages, the medieval era, and into the early Renaissance. Now, this starts to shift for a number of reasons. One, this explosive understanding in the Renaissance of art as it relates to architecture and mathematics. So, for example, Here's a guy named Alberti who comes up with this notion that you can understand how to correctly represent the world three-dimensionally through math. And I'm not going to explain the particular sort of geometric details of this drawing here, but the idea here is you take the viewer's eye and you consider a single vanishing point, that's the center, and that vanishing point goes all the way to the horizon. Every other aspect you make in a painting relates to that single vanishing point. And later on, we'll get dual vanishing point perspective and things like that. But this was a huge step forward because now you can create three-dimensionally accurate and realistic paintings. The other thing that helped this out was the Renaissance was also a time of great sea exploration, and navigators learned that by using a grid, as in like a wooden frame with a wire grid on it and holding it up to the stars or to the horizon, you could actually plot the course of things in a much more realistic way. And that grid architecture, that grid representation of reality, was another method for perspective painting. What does that result in visually? Here is Masaccio's Madonna and Child. Side note, if you're an artist and you are painting during the Renaissance, Madonna and Child, always a good choice. Jesus and Mary, baby Jesus and Mary. You can't walk 5 feet in any Renaissance city without seeing a painting of Jesus and Mary. But here we have a much more scenically realistic and three-dimensionally accurate painting. The other thing that perspective painting gives you an opportunity to do is create symbolism when you choose your vanishing point. Here's a diagram of this painting. The vanishing point is Mary's womb, which obviously is a really big deal from a Catholic standpoint. So we have this beautiful painting that is also three-dimensionally accurate and realistic and has a nice undertone of symbolism. Here's another great example. This is Da Vinci's Adoration of the Magi, and this is just a sketch. Look at the mathematical obsession and precision that was put into making the stairs vanish in the right place and getting the angles right and the numbers and the lines. This is just a sketch from Adoration of the Magi. Here's the whole painting, and look what a tiny area of that painting was consumed by that sketch. It's just the background. And it is, again, a step towards deeply obsessive, mathematical, geometric representation of real life on canvases. So, what does theater do about this? Well, we get perspective painting and scene design. Now, if you're doing a show in Renaissance Italy, you're probably doing it in front of a flat painted backdrop that is a really cool visual demonstration of a noble's ability to pay a wealthy and accomplished artist to draw him a three-dimensionally realistic scenic backdrop. And this stuff gets, right, these are pretty generic street scenes. This stuff gets a little bit ridiculous. Here's Bernoccini's The Senate Hall. Talk about detailed perspective drawing. Here's another one. This is just obsessive in terms of the ability to show off your ability as a noble to pay an artist to make incredible neoclassical visual design. This doesn't really do anything for the shows, frankly. These are, again, they look like they have dimension. You see the actors on the stage there, but that's just the way it was painted. These are flat painted backdrops. So they're really pretty, but from an acting and storytelling standpoint, they don't really do a whole lot for theater. Just kind of interesting thing to think about. And expanding on that, you want to talk about obsessive luxury. In addition to nobles and wealthy people having flat painted backdrops at their theaters and their houses, people get together and build enormous, obsessively realistic, quote unquote realistic, Greek and Roman reproductions of theaters. The Teatro Olimpico is one example of this. This is the theater that's built over 4 years, 1580 to 1584. It is commissioned by the Olympic Academy of Vicenza. So we're talking about a serious sort of erudite organization of men in the city of Vicenza who want to show everybody else that we've got the best city, that we know the best about what the Greeks and Romans did, and that we're going to reproduce it. It's an indoor theater. It has a 3,000 seat capacity. So try to imagine that. That's an absurd number. And it's still around today. So here it is. Here's what it looks like. Visually beautiful. This arced arena, this really ornate, detailed backdrop. And this is one of the very few occasions when they actually built the thing instead of just having a flat painted backdrop. And they thought this was an accurate reproduction of an interior Roman theater. There's no historical evidence that interiors of Roman theaters looked like this. There were hardly any Roman theaters that were indoors anyway. But they had some historical material and they wanted to make something really cool and lavish, so this is what they made. you'll notice, this is the front on view, right? You'll notice that there is vanishing point perspective in the three-dimensionally realistic scene design, which is awesome and fascinating and totally visually compelling, but you can't enter from back there because if you go all the way back there, the reason it looks small is because it is small. It's really small to make it look far away. So if an actor entered from the back of this central entryway, he's going to look like he's 25 feet tall, and then he's going to look like he shrinks as he walks towards the entryway. Totally impractical. Visually, really beautiful. Here is an overview of the design of the theater with regards to, I like to show this for, the mathematical geometric obsession with detail and realism, right? Here's another great example, the Teatro Farnese in Parma. This was the first proscenium arch, so there's a nice little bit of historical background for you. We're used to a proscenium arch, but this was the first one. But again, this is a fantastic example of what they thought Greeks and Romans did, which may be accurate, probably not, and it has almost no practical application, but it looks really cool. These are photographs. This theater still exists today. So you see there on stage the first proscenium arch, a nice picture frame notion. But again, I'll back up a slide. This is where the seating is. And if you wanted to have like a big battle scene or a bunch of horses running around or something dramatic, you could do that out here in the middle. But you're 1,000,000 miles away from that proscenium arch. This is much more about having wealthy people over and saying, hey, look how great we are. Look how great our city is. The show is not necessarily the most important thing. There are opportunities for giant visual amazing spectacle in terms of theatrical storytelling. You could do that. But by and large, this is about giant amazing spectacle, not about storytelling, but about our town and how much money we have and how much we understand the Greeks and Romans. So a lot of these ideas are fascinating, but don't really go anywhere. They don't have historical legs by any means. They're cool to look at, and they're a good visual expression of how obsessed these people were with ancient Greece and ancient Rome and doing everything like the Greeks and Romans did, or doing everything like they imagined the Greeks and Romans did. But it doesn't go far. On the other hand, an entertainment form that does go far, but that we don't have scripts for, is this public entertainment. So if the visually and academically indulgent neoclassical stuff is for the private, by and large, it's for nobles and the nobles' friends, Commedia dell'arte is a public entertainment for the masses, and it spreads all over Europe. We're talking about troupes of traveling players, and troupes of traveling players have been around since the ancient Roman days. But these groups really spring up a lot more. And so these are groups of people who move from town to town. They're inherently itinerant. They don't have a home. They're constantly on tour. And they take care of both street performance forms and court performance. And basically the way this works is your Commedia troupe will move from town to town. Frequently, you will send somebody ahead to the next town to have a couple of beers in a pub and get the local gossip, learn all the local inside jokes, come back and tell you. And then what you're going to do is roll into the town square, set up shop, right? And this is a little tiny portable stage, if any stage at all. And you will have performances done by stock characters wearing masks. And the stock characters are established characters that everybody in Italy and eventually everybody in Europe knows who they are and what they're all about. The masks make it really easy to tell who's who and really easy to understand the story. And your performance will probably include a bunch of those inside jokes that you learned about the town where you're going. So the show changes from town to town depending on what mayor we want to make fun of or what little local gossip we want to work into the show, et cetera, et cetera. So these are flexible, financially oriented shows. And by financially oriented, I mean the only way a Commedia troupe gets paid is they pass the hat around the town square after they're done. And if people put money in the hat, great. And if they did a bad show, they're not going to put money in the hat. If your Commedia troupe is really good, you may get invited to perform at the nobleman's court in the town you're in. So they start off on the street, but if they do well, they're frequently invited into court. And the best Commedia troupes eventually end up only primarily playing in court venues. So talk about who the characters are. And these are stock characters. They have simple, straightforward personality traits. And like I said, they are familiar to the audience. So it's really easy for the audience to understand the story and who these people are. Here's one classic one, Brighella. The Brighella character is always this selfish, clever, opportunistic servant. It's the person who's supposed to be serving, but in fact is doing slightly or very devious things behind the scenes to get what he or she wants. You may recall Pseudolus from A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. That is a definite Brighella type. And you'll see that character in just about every Commedia show. Arlecchino, or Harlequin, as we've come to know him, is this court jester and this causer of chaos. Basically the person who's anarchic and hides behind things and gives other people a hard time and just generally causes trouble, but funny trouble all throughout the show. Bart Simpson would be a great example of a contemporary Commedia Arlecchino. We are filled with all kinds of these types of chaos causers all throughout the history of TV, movies, and theater. But Bart's one of the most sort of contemporary and relevant ones. I also would like to note Arlecchino is holding a wooden stick right there. That stick has a solid wooden handle. It's a little shorter than a baseball bat. It has a solid wooden handle that connects to two long, thin pieces of wood. And those long, thin pieces of wood are separated naturally by the way it's built, separated by air. And so when you hit somebody, say when you slap somebody with that stick, the two pieces of wood slap together and make a loud wooden smacking sound. And if what we're getting at here is this thing is a slapstick. That's exactly where the word comes from. So a lot of the roots of contemporary comedy come right out of Commedia, both character types and things like the word slapstick, which we've heard forever and ever. That's an actual slapstick. Here's another one, Pantalone, the stingy, controlling old man. And you can find this person as the common antagonist in just about every comedy. Here's one example, right? You think of the principal, Rooney, from Ferris Bueller's Day Off, would be a great example of a Pantalone. And the Pantalone doesn't have to be an antagonist, but by and large, they are conservative. They want to control things. The Pantalone is frequently lecherous in a way that's really inappropriate. Rooney wasn't like that, but you see that sometimes with the Pantalone character as well. Then there's the Dottore, this pompous old man, typically a doctor or a lawyer, who's actually has no idea what he's talking about at all. This is sort of the quintessential bumbling college professor who pretends to know everything but actually doesn't know anything. Another version of this in more contemporary times would be Professor Farnsworth, for those of you who know about Futurama. That would be one tiny example, but we see plenty of Dottores here and there. Other Commedia characters worth knowing about. There's the Capitano. This one should be really familiar. The Capitano is simply the cowardly braggart, the guy who talks a big game, but when it comes time to fight, gets scared and runs away. And you'll notice this Capitano is laden by his ridiculous, overly expressive gear of war. Right? He looks like a really badass soldier and he's got all the stuff of being a badass soldier, but actually he's going to run away and hide. Obviously, the clearest one here is the Cowardly Lion for Capitano. There are plenty of other versions of that, and there are also versions of that person in real life. I'm sure you know a Capitano or two in your day. Last of all, the only unmasked characters are the lovers. The lovers, generally speaking, are pretty. They're not usually very smart. They're not usually very interesting. They usually drive the plot. The primary plot of most Commedia comedy pieces is how are the lovers going to get together? And all the other characters sort of conspire to help them or prevent them, and shenanigans ensue, and it's all hilarious. But the lovers are never terribly interesting. They're just the young, attractive people in the cast, which is why they don't have to wear masks. So we've got traveling players, street performance, or if you're lucky, court performance, performing stock characters wearing masks. Improvisation obviously is the key here, and comedy, and it's also worth noting, Commedia doesn't have to be funny. There are plenty of examples of tragic Commedia stories. By and large, they're comedy, but still. How do we put these actual comedy pieces or tragedy pieces together in terms of performance? Two aspects. One, beforehand, the group will lay out a set of scenarios. The scenarios will be the arc or the bones of the plot of the little performance you're doing. In between those scenarios, we will layer in Lazzi. And I'll give you some examples of both the scenario and the way in which Lazzi would be layered in. So, here's a Commedia scenario, which again is a structure for improvisation. The scene I'm about to describe to you here might take 15 or 20 minutes in performance. It'll take me about a minute and a half to read it to you. But the actors will be responsible for expanding on the basic structure, for making use of local color, of local jokes, mentioning local things, but also just sort of expanding the story and taking it where it goes, as long as you sort of remain within the structure. Pantalone and Zanni are the two primary characters to start. Pantalone is the father and Zanni is one of the servant characters. Pantalone says that he wants to give his daughter Lydia in marriage. Coviello, who's another character, has asked for her hand and he would like to accept. Knocking. Coviello enters from the house. Then, before he enters, he overhears that Pantalone is going to give him Lydia for a wife. We're going to throw in a Lazzi right here. I'll explain what that is in a minute. Coviello and Pantalone then come to an agreement on the dowry, right? So Coviello's got to come in at some point. They haggle back and forth on the dowry. Coviello calls Lydia from the house. Lydia comes in. Lydia's going to be our lover character, so she'll be pretty and young. She realizes that she will be given in marriage to Coviello, but she doesn't want to be given away. She refuses. Another Lazzi. We're going to throw it in right there. Eventually, Coviello talks her into it, and she gives way and touches Coviello's hand. Like I said, this seems like a really simple, straightforward scene. You could expand this out in terms of improv in 100 different directions. You could involve audience members as props, as other servants. You could do all sorts of things to expand and take it in different directions. These are the basic organizational bones of the scene from which a Commedia troupe would improvise. Now, in case you're getting bored with this scene, we're going to throw in, as you noted in the script before, Lazzi. Lazzi are basically total non sequitur, interact, or in the middle of an act entertainments. For example, here's the Lazzo of the apples. Harlequin and Pantalone tame a bear by throwing him apples, which he catches perfectly in his mouth. What? So, again, right, let's go back here and take a look at our scenario. Imagine Pantalone will give him Lydia for a wife. Then, over here, we have two people taming another guy in a bear costume and throwing him his apples. Hup, ho, and he catches them, and then we move along with the scene. So there's a real chaos to Commedia in some form because we don't want you, the audience, to get bored. So there's the Lazzo of the apples. The Lazzo of vomit. At the beginning of a performance, or just after drinking some of the doctor's medicine, Harlequin vomits. Good, solid fun. Simple, straightforward, easy humor. The Lazzo of the rising dagger. After hearing about the physical perfections of a certain woman, Pantalone's dagger begins to rise between his legs. Get it? Dagger? Yeah, right. Not a lot of terribly complex storytelling here, but fun, easy, accessible comedy. And in cases, tragedy, right? Lazzos are used less often in tragedy, but still, occasionally to have little interact entertainments to lighten the mood. So this combination of scenarios and Lazzi is what constitutes a Commedia performance. Now, we're not going to see Commedia dell'arte in any of the actual plays we read, but we are going to see these Commedia characters, and we are going to see similar Commedia storytelling structures. So as we move forward this semester, reading post-Renaissance plays, or plays during the Renaissance in their respective countries, keep an eye out for those influences of Commedia. Tartuffe has quite a few of them, but you can also find them in various Shakespearean plays and a handful of other places. So, that ends our lecture on the Italian Renaissance, and thank you very much.